everybody. Welcome to the Blackboard Innovative Teaching Series. This is Sharon Anthus from Blackboard. And before we get officially started, I wanted to just do another quick sound check to make sure that everybody can hear me okay. So if you can put a quick green check mark next to your name, that would be great. Well, thank you so much. Sounds like everyone can hear me. So also before we go into today's session, we just like to do a quick overview of Blackboard Collaborate and make sure that everybody knows how to set up their audio. So if you can't hear us, then please go ahead and set up the audio. And I'll just give that a moment so people can do their audio sound on the audio wizard. Also, we just want to do a quick overview of the user interface for those of you who may not be familiar with Blackboard Collaborate. So there's 3 panel windows: the audio-video panel, the participant and session panel, and then the chat panel. Also, as you just used the voting options, but for those of you who didn't use it, there is an option to select yes or no in the participant panel. Sometimes when we ask you questions like, can you hear us, use the option to put the green check mark. So asking questions, we ask that everybody is muted today just because there are so many people on today's session. We do ask you to enter all your questions into the chat window, and we'll have people answer them, or we'll do it live on the audio session as well. We do ask that if you are asking a question, so please just put a Q next to your question, just so we can differentiate if it's just a comment or a question, and that way we'll make sure to get to answer it. Also, sometimes when there are so many questions coming through the chat window, it's helpful to detach your chat window. And so here are the instructions. You just select that little icon in the chat panel and select the last option, which is just detach panel, and you can enlarge it by pulling out the corner. And that way you can see all the questions that are asked, and it's much easier to follow. So we just wanted to highlight all of the upcoming BITS webinars. So today's session, we have Cheryl Cyrus from our Blackboard Consulting Organization, who will be discussing the ins and outs of writing effective discussions questions. Next week, we have a session on creating test pools and surveys. The week after, it's Are You Bored with Discussion Boards? It's collaborative strategies for blended and online courses. And then after that, we have a few sessions dedicated to K-12 content. And those are our Blackboard Innovative Teaching Series sessions for April. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker today. We've got Cheryl Cyrus, who's a senior consultant with the Blackboard Consulting Organization. Prior to coming to Blackboard, Cheryl, her background includes being a distance education director for Georgia College in Instructional Technology, an implementation analyst for the state of Florida and Department of Education. So Cheryl, welcome, and thank you so much. I'd like to pass it on over to you.
Thanks, Sharon. It's a wonderful opportunity to be with you today, so I'm excited to discuss our topics that we've included for writing effective discussion board questions. So with that said, I thought that it might be nice to start out and segue the conversation into more or less thinking about what really happens when we want to invoke the possibility of having an online community within that discussion board. And consequently, a lot of that is going to revolve around writing those effective questions. Excuse me. So I thought that we would go ahead and dissect today's opportunity into almost thinking about producing a play. So we're going to start out by discussing how to set the stage and then go into directing. Next, obviously, rehearsal, talk about what possibly might be those rewrites, and then consequently production, and lastly, curtain calls. So join me as we discover how to hopefully write more engaging questions to involve a more online community within that medium. So we're going to circle around some of these quotes that I pulled today. I thought that they best represented what our topic is. So engaged learning is focused on the learner, and that's really what's going to drive today's topics. So we want to make sure that we remember that the learner is the integral role, and consequently we want them to be the generation of new knowledge, and that's what we're going to look at more granularly. And the other one, in an engaged learning environment, each learner's actions contribute not only to the individual knowledge, meaning theirs, but also to the community of knowledge, which of course is going to be our discussion board and those participants within it. So let's go ahead and look at how we can help do that in a better way. So again, we're going to start with setting the stage, and I think that we'll all agree that discussion forums are a powerful way of actually creating virtual meetings. And so when we keep in mind of what a virtual meeting is, we want to also keep cognizant of that it doesn't matter necessarily where the learner is actually coming from when they provide the conversation. So this is nice that we can go ahead and set it up in either a synchronous or an asynchronous way. But above all, we need to make sure that we involve everyone. And so I believe that with the right planning, we can get all the students involved and ultimately keep them engaged. So first it starts with a conversation. So as you can see here, a conversation is definitely going to be where we want to begin to engage the students in our discussion board. So we want to invoke the idea that the discussion board is consequently an arena that we're going to use to invoke these conversations with our students and obviously circulate around that content for the purpose of the topic or the forum. So next we want to think about engagement. So this is going to be crucial as we look to designing our discussion board in an engaging way, if you will. So after all, if you think about what we do naturally outside of a discussion board, if we're having a conversation with someone, we're not necessarily talking at them, right? We're talking with them. So consequently, our information is flowing back and forth as we're providing conversation and we're listening to their conversation back so that it becomes almost circular. So that's what we want to start thinking of. The discussion board seems to be almost a binary medium where we think that we provide X statement or question, and consequently the student responds to it, and then we respond to the student. And so it consistently has this doorway where it's just open and closed between ourselves and the student. So we want to find ways of starting to promote conversations across the students to one another. And that's what's really going to drive the conversation and the engagement. Because as you know, we do that innately as we converse in person with everyone. So we want to keep up that momentum in the discussion board. So with that said, we want to also create a community. So I already know that you know that the community of learners within your course in and of itself is there for a purpose. Either they're taking the course because it's part of their program or they're taking it for reasons of interest. So consequently, that community innately has a shared value. They need to complete the course as part of their curriculum, their program, and consequently their major, or they have a concerted effort and interest in the value of meeting in this course and consequently being successful in it. So when we think about those values, we're all coming together for the same purpose. So we want to engage the discussions as a place to share. So again, doing what we do naturally if we were sitting with these same people that shared these values. So that brings us to literally the value. So remember that discussions are an integral part of building community, and I know that you know that. But the harder part is how you actually write the questions to build engagement. So when we engage the conversations, we want to think about the value. What is the value of the topic? What is the value of the forum or thread that we propose in our discussions? And lastly, I want to leave you with, I think, the most important slide, and that is content. So this will be our takeaway for today. As you can see, we've come full circle when we think about the different attributes of going to naturally have this conversation and consequently provide this full circle for us. So remember that your learners are taking the course with the intention to expand their knowledge. So we always want to remember to keep them engaged, but also to let them know why it is that we want to engage them in the different objectives that we have set forth. We also want to be appreciative of what their current challenges are, if any. and perhaps even what their interests or their passions are. We already know that one of their passion, perhaps a value, is the content and the curriculum that's going to be contained in the course. But once you start to have two-way conversations between yourselves and the students, you'll also gain additional insight that you can then apply to expand the learning and to create a deeper community as you start to reach out with some of those nuances that you pick up with having those conversations. So let's get into how we actually direct the approach. So the first thing we want to do is actually define the approach. We want to make sure that we close the gap between yourself and your students, and you can do that in many different ways. Remember that to be an effective instructional designer and/or instructor, you want to be appreciative that you speak with learners in ways that are very direct and very personal and open, meaning that you want to be authentic, right? If we were speaking to them as we are today, we would want to do the same thing in a discussion board. We don't want to change that normalcy of what we do innately. So consequently, it will promote a two-way dialogue because I'm not necessarily always the taker and the giver. I want it to be both. I want sometimes I'm the giver and sometimes I'm the taker so that that conversation is more circular instead of two-way. So you want to make sure that you're always working to create a truly conversational culture. That's really what's going to drive today's topic. So consequently, the next one is pursue a clear agenda. And so by that, I mean that we've heard often from students in different higher ed, most likely, is the lack of consistency. So when we look at those end of course surveys, some of the comments that commonly come up is that the instructor or the instructional designer, the discussion board curator, actually had some type of lack of consistency. So that could be in timing or it could be in the way that they respond. So we want to make sure that what we set forth is a pattern that we consistently keep with. Next, we also want to make sure that we conduct regular polls or surveys, and that's easily done with the Blackboard Learn survey tool. So remember that surveys are nicely used intermittently within a course. Sometimes we see the designs that they'll create surveys in the very beginning of the course, an interest survey, and then they'll end with a course survey to find out how the user experienced the course or enjoyed it. But I'd like to entertain the idea that you use surveys on a consistent basis. And I mean that in as much as 3 questions are fine. 1 to 3 questions, there's nothing wrong with that, just to spark interest. And they usually expand the topic. And what we're going to see is we're actually going to use those results of those surveys as part of that discussion board to use that as a leap, if you will, towards conversations that have a more personal interest. And we spoke about that in the beginning. This is how you're actually going to find out what their challenges are as well as what their personal interests are and insight. So remember also when we look at the next one, provide substantive responses, and that's going to be huge. I know that when I'm in a course, if I'm reading a response from an instructor, I necessarily want to embody what I said, not necessarily, yes, great job. And I think you know that. So that's going to be a key as we look at some of those design principles and how we respond to the students. And remember that you want to lead the discussion in the right direction continually. That is sometimes not always easy to do, especially if you allow the students to create their own threads, which is actually a very good practice, one of the best practices in higher level thinking skills. But when we do that, sometimes those threads can actually start to get a little bit wide, and we want to make sure that we keep the conversation and the interest going, and we want to bring in new conversations, but we also want to remember that you have a clear objective to that reason of the thread or the forum. And so when we look at that last one to the next one, engage students in active learning, by allowing them to create those threads actually promotes that active learning because they're able to start to talk to one another, and so it takes away from more of that streamline and it opens up to more of a web-based, if you will, so that we're starting to have conversations among conversations. Remember also that you want to post timely responses. We don't want to bring in a new concept when we haven't even responded to the old ones. And not that I want you to think of it in terms of binary, but I just want you to keep focus of the learner that they need to understand that there's conversations going, and we can invoke new conversations, but we want to make sure that we're timely, because we can really lose the momentum if we don't have timely responses. And then lastly, I want you to keep in mind that we don't necessarily have to tell a student how they need to cite references. We do that by modeling it. So as we start to promote those forums or threads, we want to make sure that as we model the references, it's to help the students with perhaps some of those challenges. So remember that we want to always have the conversation, but also if we have any reference to outside references, that we're able to cite that so that it's easily accessible for the student to be able to access it. And by doing that, you're modeling what your expectation of how they should respond with their references or resources if it were pertinent. So next we want to create connections, and this is maybe one of the harder parts, if we will, when we start to look at these slides. So when we think about using a blog post comment, keyword comment, to start a conversation in a forum or thread. So if you had the either an assignment, or maybe it was just something like a water cooler type blog where they actually went in and did something personal, it's nice to be able to use that blog in that atmosphere. But how you begin to make connections is taking those comments from blogs, whether it's your blog or a course blog, and then starting those conversations so that you start to see a blended environment. So consequently, again, this course is becoming more of a community. Remember also to take the question or the comment included in those recent surveys. So this is what I was referring to earlier, whether it's a 1-question or 3-question survey, really quick about something that had to do with the content or the curriculum, or even maybe an activity they had just completed. How nice it is to begin to have that so that they show that they see value in that what you're doing is not always these curt siloed assignments or activities, so that you're taking these assignments and these requisites that you're asking them to do, and that they can see that there's value in all of it, and that it almost overflows into everything that they'll do within the course. Of course, we're going to scaffold that, but we want to be able to use those just like a circle. When we think about a wheel and those spokes, we want to use each and every one of them. And notice the next one, share a post or a comment from another course section. So for those of you that teach multiple sections, isn't it nice to be able to connect members, especially with the new social tools in Blackboard for those of you that are using the cloud features. So again, you don't necessarily have to use those social tools, but you do want to bring in so that they know that what the other students are thinking or feeling, that you're starting to blend that, and especially in those courses that are, you know, upper level, that are more towards their major, because in theory they're going to be working with like people as they move on. So we want to invoke this idea of the curriculum is not just siloed in the course, but it becomes part of them. So I think all of this will actually help you to drive what would be referred to as an active community. So next you'd want to make sure that you can demonstrate the actions. And so by that I mean that you want to make sure that, again, you're the one that's promoting the behavior. So you want to demonstrate how it is that you listen to others. Well, obviously if you're creating surveys or you're taking comments from the blogs, they're starting to see your representation that you are listening, because that's how you're eliciting this information that you're extracting from those areas. You also can show by modeling how you can paraphrase that information. So it's nice to be able to give reference or resource to you know, the comment that you received, that you're using this, not perhaps a survey, because it should be anonymous in as much as if someone had made that comment. But if you did want to take a comment off a blog or a journal, then it'd be nice to, again, model how you're paraphrasing that, even though you can go ahead and cite that reference. And then how do you involve others by using those comments? Can you find some commonality between the different comments and start to tie them together? Or perhaps they're the antithesis of each other, and so you can start to discuss how we might bridge those two spectrums together. So that's how we would begin to involve others that perhaps hadn't necessarily created or wrote those comments. And then next it says show that you're genuinely concerned. And this is where we go back to the beginning that I was referencing, being authentic. I think that students can innately see on a discussion board if it looks almost as if you're just taking cliche comments and remarks back to them. And so consequently they're going to have a pushback and they're not going to be as engaged. I think that we can agree to that. So again, you know, remember that we want to keep very small chunks, if we will, to show them that we are genuinely concerned and we want to stay on topic so that we don't just, you know, have a lot of words just for the purpose of posting. And then the next one, show how feedback is being used. We're really going to see that in the upcoming slides. That's going to be one of the kickers in really understanding how to do this process that I'd like to share with you. So again, it's going to be very important to show how the feedback is being used, but we've already done that when we think about using the comments on different blogs, or perhaps that they get to see value, that if you're sharing information from other course sections of like activities, then perhaps they would also know that you're probably sharing their comments and posts with other sections. So again, it's really important that all of this is really done through modeling. So you want to really, really let the learner know that you value their participation. And the way that you do that, not just on the discussion board, but throughout the course, is to bring the parts together, consistently keep them fluid so that they're not siloed. Also, you want to model expectation of experience. So when I have an expectation of what I feel an activity might culminate with, I'm going to model that with how I respond with my students and interact with them. And I think that's going to be real important. The same thing if you have groups that perhaps there's one group that's doing, you know, really stellar and another group that's a little bit challenged. How nice it is to look at the group that's necessarily doing it in the way that you had felt, and just kind of showcase that and to show them that that was the modeling. You don't have to necessarily come out and say that, but as you start to bring their examples in, the students have feedback and they're understanding what your expectation was, because again, you know, the accolades are going to those types of experiences. And remember above all that it is their responsibility for helping to make the discussion board worthwhile. So when you show value in them and you show value in the board itself, it's going to become a worthwhile experience for all, not only for you, but also with them. Remember that you want to initiate a lot of appropriate interaction. So again, when we think about the terms of chunking, we want to keep that in mind primarily. You don't have to have a long dissertation, if you will, of a response to someone. It needs to be fluid, and consequently the level of interaction in order to manage it is going to be somewhat smaller. We don't need to have paragraphs of responses. We can also promote critical thinking by actually using this methodology when we think of that chunking in those smaller interactions that are more fluid amongst all your learners. Again, it's going to begin to promote excuse me, critical thinking. And above all, remember to make it interesting and relevant to the students. And sometimes that's hard to do depending on the different content that you need to invoke. And that's where we want to definitely reach out to the different uses that the students may utilize so that they can bring their own personal aspect to it, so that perhaps if that content did appear to be very concrete, that we can start to bring in more aesthetic feelings from your learners and perhaps how they can associate to it, and it'll help drive that content and curriculum learning.
Hey Cheryl, before you jump in, there is a question in the discussion in the chat that I just wanted to see if you could address. From Larry from Villanova. Faculty interaction may not be appropriate if the discussion is being graded. How do you differentiate the student understanding and participation?
Okay, so I think your question, and great question, actually Villanova was one of my projects, so it's nice to have the question, thank you. So how do you differentiate the student understanding and participation? That is an often question that's asked, and of course my my first response would be to have two types of rubrics. One would be on the student understanding, and then the second one would be the participation. And I think the participation, usually most clients will agree that the rubric for participation is pretty staple, meaning that when you set out with your course, you would decide how much of the participation is warranted within the discussion board. But what I think you're going to find is that as you start to build a more engaged environment, the students, I hope, will become more engaged naturally and not consistently just responding for the purpose of participation in the rubrics, the points associated in the rubric. And so consequently, as the participation is more engaging, I think that the learner's concentration and the learner's takeaway, if you will, that's going to be the easier. So what I see commonly, especially with this new methodology, is that the content is being consumed and the content is being understood, and consequently the rubric is almost like, yes, they already know it's already done because of the way that you've structured the discussion board and the learning. But I'm not sure if that was where your question was going, but I would definitely recommend two rubrics so that you can associate the participation and dissect it. And I hate to use that word because that's really not where we're going today. But when it comes to a graded, I do think that you do need to dissect that rubric, to have two rubrics, one for participation and one for content. And that's not to say that you have to grade participation with every discussion board. You know, I think that there's a lot of learning to be had, and I think also in reflection, especially maybe your higher level courses, the students are going to recognize that if this becomes an invaluable teaching methodology or medium, that they're going to be at a loss. And again, I don't mean that punitively, but they're going to be at a loss because there was much to be gained, especially in the learning, had they taken a little bit more of an engaging part in that discussion board. So I hope that, again, thinking about that circle, that it will literally become full circle, and consequently they'll be engaged more for that reason. Okay, good. And I don't think I saw, Sharon, I'm sorry, I think it scrolled up, Dragon software.
Yeah, so there's a question that came in from Margie. I find if I use voice recognition software, so Dragon, I'm more likely to compose a more complete response than if I'm typing. Anyone else find that typed answers tend to be shorter and less complete?
Okay, and I think we probably could agree with that. I am very familiar with Dragon, and we do have a lot of, well, we have the voice technology coming, so I think that that's probably also going to lend itself. Remember that you can always upload an audio file, and now with the video everywhere, it's wonderful. But still, when we think about those mediums, I think that you're going to see that using these principles and using this practice of methodology, regardless of the medium that you use, is still going to invoke that engaging community, which is really where we want to go. And we're going to learn how to do more about that in the coming slides. So the next one has to do with providing guidance. I think that, again, we've talked about this pretty much already as far as engaging the learner. Remember that we want to stay on topic and to do that redirection. This is the part, though, that we're going to start to look at a little bit more granularly. Summarizing the information presented by the students. I want you to really remember that one because I'm going to show you a couple slides, and that's going to be key. Outlining what remains to be discovered. So those two are really what's going to drive your responses, as we're going to start to see. And then when we think about that higher level thinking skills, we want to remember about the taxonomy of Socratic methods and how we could actually pose the different types of questions to begin to escalate, if you will, and provide more of a hierarchy and scaffold, if you will, of the Socratic question types. And we do that by actually positioning the different questions strategically. So it doesn't mean that you have to have them verbatim, but just have, again, that idea, that framework of how you're going to escalate this discussion based on this topic or this preface, and how we're going to escalate that so that they not only become engaged, but we are scaffolding it. So we can do that by probing underlining concepts. So we can get, that's a good baseline to be able to do that. We can also probe for assumptions. This is a wonderful way to begin conversations, to probe for assumptions. And again, this probably lends itself to 3,000 or 4,000 courses and up. But again, we want to understand what it is. And this is also another way when you think about, I asked you to be appreciative of those challenges. This is another way that you would do that. So perhaps if a challenge was a misunderstanding, then by probing for the assumptions, you're going to gain entry into that. And probe for evidence. What evidence did they have? So it doesn't necessarily have to mean that anything is right or wrong. We also want to probe for implications and consequences. So what would happen? So again, I think that most of us are pretty familiar with the Socratic method, but just I want to really push that home because that seems to really drive the scalability of scaffolding for higher level thinking skills within a discussion board. Okay. And we definitely want to communicate. I unfortunately had the opportunity to meet with someone, and they told me that they weren't sure, their exact words were, they weren't sure if they had a discussion board in their course, and if they did, they wouldn't know where to find it. So I thought that this was so obvious, but on the other hand, I just want to really drive that home. I want you to expand the awareness of the discussion board, and obviously with our new global navigation, that's going to almost be an 8-ly as part of that ribbon, because the updates, if you will, are going to definitely flow into there. The posts are going to flow in and out, and so that the learner can definitely, stay aware. And so I know that a lot of the notifications can be set that you don't necessarily have to see all of them, but I would encourage you as a designer or instructor that the learners do stay abreast of those posts so that they can begin to see this conversation. Not to be cliche, but I want you to think of the discussion board as we move forward. We're going to center on the curriculum aspect of it, but I want you to think of it in terms of like a Twitter or a Facebook. I was recently at a conference, and I was watching the people in front of me, not that I could see, but I just saw everyone on their phones, and 90% of them were on Facebook just looking at the posts because that's how conversational it is. And so I want you to start to think of that we want to really start to chunk. You want to highlight the best practice, so the person that has a good response and is part of that conversation in a continuum, you want to highlight that and represent that that's a good way to communicate with others. And then you want to reinforce understanding and obviously provide any resources as an instructor would. So I think the takeaway as we leave this section is definitely going to be that you want to make sure that you provide a clear and motivating vision. You want to expand the awareness by letting your users know, the learners, what the discussion board is, where it is, and what your expectation is. You also want to ensure that you highlight the best practice. So showcased often any of those positive responses and engagements that you have. And remember to reinforce by doing and setting examples yourself of what those expectations are. And above all, you always want to remember to provide resources. So those are those rubrics. They are any external resources that you make reference to. They perhaps are your standalone netiquette policies. Now all of this can be in those standalone documents so that if I, the learner, have read them 2 or 3 times, I don't necessarily have to click on them each time. But I shouldn't have to also go back and look for one if I'm in the 12th board perhaps of the environment, and you're referencing something that was an expectation. Now I have to go back through the syllabus to find that information. So remember that you always want to provide rubrics, resources, any type of netiquette or how-to, even if it were some type of IT or to yourself, and maybe even how to upload, how to post that video everywhere, or how to upload an attachment or an assignment, something that is an expectation. And when you put those all in one file and it goes with every single posting, then it relaxes me as a learner because I know if I have any questions, all my resources are right there immediately at my disposal.
Hey, Cheryl. A couple questions, if you don't mind. So one from Rashid. Can you explain more about those times when we should or should not get involved in their discussion?
Okay, that's a very good question. And I think one of them, the one that comes to mind is probably one that well, it's twofold. One might be that you have a topic of conversation that takes opinions. And so consequently, there can be escalation based on that. And so you're right, as an instructor, it is a little bit harder to de-escalate the momentum. But what I would encourage you to do is to find parts within that to start a new, if you will, a new direction so that you can still show them that you value their opinion, but right now we're not there to actually escalate the whether it's right or wrong. That wasn't the premise. And when you think about that, that's actually very good question formatting, is to, especially on Socratically. So when the student understands Socratically that there won't necessarily be that end-all answer as far as a right and wrong, maybe a lot of that has to do with your modeling and showing that and demonstrating to them that, you know, we're all in it to have this conversation. But if you do feel that it starts to escalate, then I would definitely just find points within each of those conversations and start to segue off into a new direction. And then perhaps you can start to dissipate it, and then consequently, if it needed to be closed, you could. I would not recommend excuse me, that you close down a conversation because of inappropriate behavior, something like that. Unfortunately, if that does, there are many mediums in Blackboard that you can curtail their activity in a discussion board so you can actually prevent them from posting if it seemed to be one student and you've worked with that student on a continuous basis. But you want to show that we're a community, and so consequently as a community we are going to have differences of opinion, and we are going to all want to provide our opinion and the premise for it, I think. So we don't want to lose the momentum, and that's going to be a really fine line. So I appreciate that question. That's a fine line, and probably one that comes with finesse in doing it over and over. Good question. So let's talk about rehearsal. Let's get into what we're going to do. So I have a little quiz. I'm not going to actually ask you to respond to it. But this was actually a question that was posed on the discussion board, and obviously you can see that it had a specific learning outcome that was associated to it. And so consequently it was written directly for the purpose of targeting this goal or this objective that the instructor wanted the students to know, and show you know, evidence that they knew the answers. So again, it's not real important to get every word of it, but I just wanted you to have an idea of what the question was. And the reason I wanted to include the question is I think that you'll agree with me that, you know, there's a lot of good aspects to the question, so it should lend itself to a pretty good discussion forum or thread. And so these were the responses of the instructor after the students had promoted their answers. And I didn't want to go through and provide all the answers, but I did have the questions still over here. And so consequently, as you can imagine, the students answered with what would be somewhat very content specific. But the reason that we're meeting here today is to help us learn how we can be better. So the students did what they were asked to do, and they responded accordingly. But this is where we're going to talk about what we can do. So the instructor responses were such, and this is the part that I wanted to ask you, and not necessarily literally, but just say to yourself, what's missing? Do you see anything that's missing? It looks like the instructor definitely responded. It definitely looks like the instructor took keywords from those responses and brought them back into her response to them, or his response to them. So I'm just wondering if you had any takeaway of what was missing. So if you did, we're going to just give you a kudos, a virtual pat on the back, because we're going to look at those responses again. And as I have you look at them, I want you to listen to what the new methodology would have helped with. So the responses are specific to an individual. So in theory, this was 4 different students. They responded accordingly, and the instructor came in and responded. But the instructor responded to the individual student. So it made the conversation between the student and the instructor. It was not a response to the whole class. And consequently, if I'm being graded, going back to the question again, if I'm being graded, I'm going to look at the response that the teacher wrote to me, right, that the instructor wrote to me, because I want to know how I did. And that's the mindset that we want to try to get away from, to be honest with you. We want the responses to not only develop the discussion board, the forum, or the thread, but we want it to benefit all, meaning the whole class, because that's how we're going to not only engage the learner, but scaffold the learning. Remember that you want the response to be focused on how the question was answered by each and every student, not necessarily each student independently, almost siloed. Additionally, the responses are not substantive. They're not lending to a deeper understanding or critical thinking. So especially in the last one, you see the information you provided is incomplete. It is hard to follow what you're trying to say. Okay, I can understand that we've probably read things like that, but that's not going to scaffold the learning, and it certainly is not going to invite me as a learner to want to write more, right? So not only do we want to stay away from siloing the responses to each and every student, we want to invoke the entire students in the discussion board to be part of a conversation, not necessarily how they responded and then how I responded to them. So let's look at a new question. So we're going to do this again, and this is the question that the instructor writes. And as you can see, she provides the article summary, a link to the reference, and actually the site. So that's going to be also a best practice. So when you look at the question, again, it's still a good question. If anyone, the other one was a little bit more higher level. But that's okay. It's still a good question to begin, because you want to think about this. We want to scaffold the learning. We don't want to come out right out of the gates and have higher level immediately to stay on topic. So these are the student responses. Again, I think you'll agree that the student responses were pretty engaging. It seems like they were right, point on, and they were pretty proficient to answer the question. But this is where the difference comes. Remember that the first example I showed you, he or she gave the responses to each student independently. Watch what happens now. The instructor makes a response to everyone, not to the individual students. And again, she takes literally what they said and she puts it back into, so she's valuing what they said, and she also begins to drive the conversation now with what it is that they said, and now you can start to see she starts to engage the learner because they see value in what they said, but she begins to scaffold. And that's what's really going to be key. And also you can see that it becomes more conversational. It's not content, 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 and a question at the end. It becomes more conversational. I even like the ... in there, because to me, I can hear her speaking with me, not necessarily to me. But now we're having a conversation. So this was the next set, and I'm not going to go all through it, but here I think you can start to see. Now here lies the differentiator. Now the students are speaking as if they're in a conversation, aren't they? They're not necessarily picking A, B, or C or giving you a date back, any of that knowledge-based information. They're starting to have conversation amongst each other and the instructor. So you can see here that the board is now becoming this conversation piece, which ultimately is driving the learning outcome or the objective. And then lastly, here's the instructor response. Again, see how she addresses all of them as a collective unit. She addresses them. She shows value in what they did. Again, she still escalates. And she continues to drive the learning based on the conversations of what the students had developed and submitted. And then lastly, she continues the conversation with the one down at the bottom. So how is everything connected? And so this is where, and again, I won't take you to the next step, but I think that you can see here that now she's begun to provide value for their input. And so consequently, if I'm going to study or perhaps make sure that I have this understanding before I go to the next level, whether it's a different unit or perhaps an assessment, I'm probably, as a learner, I'm going to go back to this thread or this forum. Now there's many things that the instructor could do for the student. She could extract this information, put it in a wiki as a review. She can also take this information and put it as part of the announcements. Great job on the discussion forum we had. We learned A, B, and C. This, and again, keeping up that momentum. You want to consistently, laterally keep the momentum so that the conversation, again, is lateral. So allow the students, at first I wanted to recommend that, well, as an instructor, I'm going to take this information, I'm going to put it in a wiki, and it's going to become my review. But wouldn't it be better if perhaps during my virtual office hours or any type of review that I actually go into the discussion board? I go in there and I bring up this forum or thread, and I show the example and the value of what it was that we accomplished. I think that would be a win-win. So let's talk about the rewrites. How do we get to that point to write those type of questions? We've addressed the methods, but now we want to look at actually the questions. So writing effective discussion questions are going to be not only the scaffolding, but also to be cognizant of when we write these effective test questions, or excuse me, discussion board questions, any type of questions to be honest, we want to remember that there's 3 parts to every good question, and that is a question, a condition, and a response. Okay, so let's look at the 3 elements separately. So in a question, you want to remember to ask your students, what do you want them to do? Literally, what do you want them to do? You want them to provide what? And what information will the students need to succeed? In other words, they have to have a premise of understanding from probably point A before that they could scaffold it to B, right? So you might want to bring that back in and readdress that we learned in lesson 1 that X, Y, and Z happened, and consequently, A, B, C was a result. So this is information that they need to be successful, right? And you can get those in so that the student understands subliminally, if you will, that they need to understand this baseline before we start to scaffold this next part of the question. And then also, remember to always consider your objectives. How does the discussion activity demonstrate the outcome or competency? And this is, I really have this is probably my above all preface of everything is just to make sure that the learner understands any activity or assignment that you ask them to do that becomes part of the course should always show value in what the outcome and competency is, so that the course objectives and the course outcomes, that they show value that you're doing this for the purpose of them being successful in this course, and consequently those course outcomes. So that's huge. Whether it's unit objectives or course outcomes, they need to show what that value is. And again, you can do that within the introduction of it, or you can even have it at the beginning of the unit so that they can see what the value of this unit is, and consequently the discussion board is part of that. And next, let's look at condition. How long should the response be? What is your expectation? When must it be posted? And what format should it be posted? Is it arbitrary up to the student? Or do you have a defined way of responses? And are there any other conditions that you want to define? Now again, all of those can be part of those standalone documents that continuously go from forum to forum. You don't necessarily have to have, a page worth of description of your discussion board. You can get right to it to keep that momentum going, but these should be part of those standalones so that the student can click on those to find out any granular information that they need. And then lastly, the same thing, again, another option to put in a standalone, if you will. What must the students do in their reply? How would they interact? And all of this can definitely be part of those rubrics and what your expectations are. But they don't necessarily have to be part of each and every question. They need to have the availability to each and every forum. So I know time is escaping us, and I just want to make sure that we can get through this real quick. So let me move on to actually your production. So we want to remember that when you go to stage, if you will, when you're ready to produce, that you address the entire class rather than a single student. So all of these requisites, if you will, would be your homework for producing this discussion board. So Backstage, we want to remember that you are going to keep in mind that we're going to have a class discussion board. And consequently, the way to do that is to design it that way and to respond that way. Develop topics that are complex and open-ended. Remember some of those examples that I showed you, how open-ended they are, so that the students can begin those threads and have conversations amongst one another. use a predetermined strategy that leads the students through a topic. And that was that Socratic that I started to speak about. You want to actually have in mind where you want to go. So you don't necessarily have to have them verbatim. And if you do use publisher materials, those are a great concrete way of actually beginning the conversations, and depending how the students respond, you start to gauge and mold, if you will, that learning as an instructor and obviously your expertise. So the instructor's part of this is going to make sure that he or she always summarizes the information from what the students had provided. Whether it's positive or negative, you need to be able to summarize it and do so accordingly in the methodology of it being a teachable moment. And you always want to add something new. You probably saw that in her responses. She reiterated and summarized what the students had provided, but she also always had something out there that was something new. Remember also to scaffold those questions. So that's where you have to do some homework to begin with, that you're going to lead with this concrete knowledge-based question. It's your expectation that you're going to get to X the next time and Y the time after that. Remember to take students deeper into the material with each successive step. And again, this is a little bit of homework for the instructor, but you're going to spend less time and have a deeper understanding and an engaged, active learner if we follow these methodologies. Remember to develop a framework for critical thinking. No one needs to literally see this. You might just have a little bit of an outline that you go by each time, whether it's just A, B, C, or it goes through 4 or 5 different levels. You want to keep the learner engaged and know when to take away when you feel that the learners have digested the material to the point of your outcomes. So lastly, this would be what we definitely want as our takeaway. We want to remember that we want to lead questions by the instructor. The instructor, again, timely. They want to drive the discussion into that critical thinking, more utilizing the Socratic method, starting out with some concrete information. Remember that the instructor posts are designed to focus on the goal, meaning your objective, and using somewhat of a step-by-step approach. And again, this would definitely just be for the instructor's reflective thinking, just to make sure that they kind of stay on track. And then the instructor does a wrap-up with the students. It's very important for the instructor to bring everything that had gone full circle and bring it back to light so that the students can see value for their participation. And so consequently, as the instructor is driving this, the students are responding with answers and new information. They do that innately. And the students also interact with responses to each other, and that's what invokes that conversation, and consequently, the engagement will take place. So again, this was the slide that we had up in the beginning. And I just wanted to come back because I felt that we can see here as we look at this methodology that the takeaway today was that we came full circle, and that by completing the circle and using a conversation to engage the learner will innately build the community, and they will find value in it and consequently want to be part of it. So just to summarize, the involvement is an important aspect of engagement and commitment. So you want to find ways to involve students and allow them to influence some aspects of the content. Equally important, but almost even more important, is to remember to boost the engagement that students experience, because when they become the active producers rather than the passive consumers of that content, your content and their engagement will escalate innately. So I wanted to leave you with some quotes from students that had been part of discussion boards that used this type of methodology. So I think that you can see here that the students want this. This is part of what they want too, and I think I've told some of you before, I have two daughters, one in undergrad and one in grad, and this is exactly what they would say to me. They just kind of dread the discussion boards, but yet when they think of realms of this, because that's what they do all day, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, so they want that same type of atmosphere, and you can do that through designing and being there as an instructor with those principles that we've covered today. So Sharon, I just wanted to take an opportunity to thank everyone for joining us today, and I also wanted to have some time for any questions that anyone might have.
So there's been lots of great questions and discussion that's going on in the chat throughout. So it's a little bit hard to navigate if there are questions pointed towards you versus to other people in the chat, so I'm going to do my best to try to moderate here a bit. So one question from Kim: what would be the max optimal size class for this type of feedback for students?
As far as the discussion board in higher ed, that's a tricky question. So the way that you can groom that, if it were, I've worked with some instructors that literally have 100 to 300 in a course, and obviously you're right, that would definitely be a management piece. One of the things that we found in research was that what we used to do is put the students in different groups, and each group would be, to be honest with you, doing the same thing, except it was a smaller group to manage, and you could even allow different students or your TAs to be moderators. But what we're finding now is, in order to invoke that community, that you would have different subsections of those groups, you would have the groups, but you would have different subsections of the content, so that that individual group was working on those questions that you were promoting to them, or with them. So in other words, if you have different questions for different groups, but they're all part of the same thing that you're going to scaffold and show relevancy for. So innately you begin by designing your small groups, throwing out those questions, being part of it exactly like we saw today. But then you start to bring in what the other groups are saying to show value of bringing it together, because you would respond on the whole discussion board, meaning the class discussion board. So how nice is it to work in groups almost siloed on different topics, but still within the same framework, if you will, of the outcome. But then you tie it all together as an instructor by having that discussion board where you're actually bringing in all the responses to show value and how you guys are learning, meaning the students, how they're learning that goal or that concept. And that's going to show value of how each group also complements each other. That's a really nice way. I've even seen it extended in an anatomy class, and they actually took that and built a wiki out of it because it was just so wonderful. They almost like as a capstone project. And so each group then had their own wiki pages, but the wiki became a course wiki so that everyone used it to study for the final, and it was almost like their takeaway. So it was really good.
Okay, so there's a question from Kathy Seville. Logistically, I find students are confused by students when used together, such as, are confused by the tools when used together, such as discussion board, blog, wikis, journals. They are similar in appearance, but function differently. I've advised instructors to pick and use only those that will help in their course objectives and clearly define the tool they are using, and link to the appropriate support resources on the On-Demand Center. Have others experienced the same confusion with their students?
Right. That's an excellent point, and very common across higher ed. You're absolutely right. I would definitely recommend them to probably use only one or two tools. Now you'll have another way of thought that says allow the learner to use any tool that they want to respond, but the teacher, meaning the instructor, would be the one that uses a consistent tool. So if the discussion board, which seems to be, when we think of the realms of our learner right now, the discussion board is more aligned, if you will, to the Twitter, to the Facebook. So when we think of that modality and that medium that they're already used to, if it's higher ed, then I might suggest that the instructor continues to use that one, but you still open it to how the learner wants to respond. Because you will have some that are very technology savvy, and so if they wanted to use a video everywhere and put it as part of it, that would be wonderful. And it also shows to other students of maybe what they didn't even know the capabilities are. So again, it would be dependent on the type of activity if you could allow them to use any tool possible that they felt comfortable with. But that's exactly right. Yep, good statement. So Sharon, I just wanted to leave and let everyone know that we do have online courses available on a continuum basis. They usually start at the beginning of every month. So if anyone's interested in learning more about our opportunities, please feel free to be able to join us at blackboard.com/training.
And I just entered the link into the chat window too.
Perfect. Thank you.
And just, I will make sure that everyone gets a copy of this presentation as well as the recording. We do post it on YouTube as well. It just takes us a couple of days to get that posted, but everyone who's registered for the webinar does get all this information in a couple of days as well. So I think this brings us to the close. It doesn't seem like there are any other questions. And Larry, yes, we will get you the link to the recording so you can forward it on as well. Cheryl, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with everyone today. It was fantastic. It sounds like quite a few people did get a lot out of this. And there's a lot of great discussion as well in the chat. So I appreciate everyone responding to people's questions as well. It was great. So I think that's it. Thank you so much, everybody, and I hope you all have a good week, and we will get back together next week if you decide to join any future Innovative Teaching Series webinars. Thanks, Cheryl.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.